Hello and welcome back to Xeno series staples. I have to apologize again for the audio quality. My main microphone just had to break apart the week Definitive Edition released, so hopefully this will be fixed by next weekend. I don't think I'm going to be making any videos in the ensuing week, just so you don't have to deal with this any more than I do, and I don't know, maybe I'll just straight take a break if the thing isn't fixable and I have to order a new mic entirely. I don't know. Anyway, this is the second episode of the series, and this is covering a very major character archetype that's probably even bigger than the Van Man was. Because while that was usually a recurring, somewhat minor character, this one always involves a main playable party member in the game, and it's got a pretty big impact because a lot of the most memorable characters in the series are from this archetype. So it's even more unfortunate that I'm stuck using this audio for it. But I will make do with what I have to make do with, and for you, this will involve spoilers for the entire Xeno series, except for Xenosaga Pied Piper, Xenoblade 1's future connected expansion epilogue thing, and of course, the one game with all the important spoilers, Xenosaga Freaks. I ran into a bit of an issue with actually naming this archetype because the first thing to go to would be the Katana Man. This revolves around men who use katanas, and it goes really well with the first thing I talked about being the Van Man. But then there's Morag, who, while she doesn't use a katana, obviously displays several characteristics of this archetype, and is very much not a man, and that's a very big part of her character, so that seems a bit disrespectful to go with that. But then again, she is the only woman I'm going to be talking about in this video, and she doesn't use a katana, but then if I say the katana user, that doesn't work very well either because there are several people, not just Morag, who don't use katanas and express characteristics of this archetype. So I don't really know. I think I'm just going to say the badass katana person because that's the best compromise I could make. Anyway, this archetype was started, as with the Van Man, in the original Xeno game with Dr. Citan Uzuki of Xenogears. And he basically sets the foundation, establishing what this archetype is going to be from the get-go. This is usually going to be a badass cool guy in the party with a Japanese aesthetic and using a katana as a major weapon. This character will also usually have some big secret involving holding back information from the protagonist and potentially seeming like they're going to betray the party or actually going through with it. This character is also usually a bit older than whoever the main protagonist is, and is usually some sort of mentor figure to them, as well as a member of the previous generation of heroes, if that is a thing in this specific game. I already did make a dedicated video about the Doc himself, so I am going to keep things brief. He poses as a weirdly competent village doctor who helps and accompanies Faye, but he's actually a top-ranking agent of the Empire of Solaris, who has been assigned to watch over him and make sure he does things that align with Emperor Kane's wishes. Despite this though, and mostly before this is found out, he is almost a father figure to Faye because, you know, amnesia, no idea where his actual parents are. His real name is also Hyuga Rikido. Citan Uzuki is actually some sort of an alias, so he isn't found out, but I would just like to point out, his wife's name is Yui Uzuki. Her father's name is also Uzuki, so Citan is such a Giga Chad that when he had to disguise his name, he was just like, you know what, I'm just going to take my wife's last name, because I'm an epic dude like that. Anyway, while I said that there are some people who express characteristics of the archetype who don't use katanas, Citan is the only one who fights with a katana, and then also with some other style, barring Morag, but she's a big exception because drivers. And that is because for most of the story, he's like, hey, I don't want to destroy as much. I'm going to put my sword down and only fight barehanded, and he's still the best character in the game without that. But then, after everything kind of goes to shit, Yui is able to convince him, basically, morals don't matter anymore, we're fighting for the survival of the human race, and then he picks up his sword and becomes even better. Yeah. There is a moment where it seems like he's betrayed the party, but he ends up being a triple agent of sorts, always working for the same goal to begin with. There's also the fact that what the Emperor wants and what the Gazelle Ministry and Krellian want are two different things, so there are definitely two goals going on inside the upper management of Solaris, and what the Emperor wanted was to redeem himself, involving also freeing Abel and helping him out, and, well, Faye is the latest Abel, so even though he's working for the bad guys, it's basically he was under orders from someone who was trying to help out Faye to begin with, even though most of the rest of Solaris, probably not the best people to ally with. But hey, Ellie came from them too, so what are you gonna do? He's also usually one of the only, if not the only character who actually knows what's going on for the first 2/3 of the game, but like, once we get into the real Deus stuff, like, past the stuff that he'd be told by Kane as a Solaris agent, he's about as in the dark as everyone else, but just by virtue of being the smartest guy in the room half the time, he is still able to sort of be the brains and do that kind of thing. He's also basically perfect at most things he tries, and yeah, he does a lot of things. Fighting, engineering, doctor work, mech piloting, tactics, parenting apparently, he seems to have a happy family, and yeah, that's Satan. He's good at everything. If he was the main character, he'd be a Mary Sue, but he's not the main character, so we can just say, hey, that's a really cool guy. Anyway, as this archetype is changed and developed throughout the future games, it's interesting because for the most part, instead of just being, we're going to reuse this name and this basic character concept, it's more so future iterations of the archetype instead expand and twist upon the foundation Satan laid. This is perhaps most evident in the next character in the archetype, Jin Uzuki from Xeno Saga. Before we get into things, yes, there's a character named Jin in Xeno Saga and a different character named Jin in Xenoblade, but their names are not the same in the original Japanese version. Both of their names, when written in katakana, make up two characters, and the second character is the same, but the first is slightly different. This means that their names are pronounced differently. Xenosaga Jin is Jin in Japanese, but Xenoblade Jin is pronounced something closer to what we'd probably say Shin, and for whatever reason, the localizers decided to change that to Jin, I guess just because J and Sh can sound similar when pronounced by a Japanese speaker, and I don't know. There are some weird name changes in the two localization, and some that I'm okay with. But yeah, they're named different characters. I'm not going to refer to Blade Jin as Shin in this video, because that would just make things even more confusing. I'll just make it obvious by saying Saga or Blade Jin when it comes up. So, what is the premise of Saga Jin? Basically, what if Satan tried all the stuff, but he wasn't good at everything, was basically only good at fighting, and couldn't stay dedicated to one thing to really improve at all? I don't really want to say Jin is what if Satan kind of sucked, since he's still a competent fighter and I still like him as a character, but compared to Satan, I mean, he kind of does. I guess the best way to explain it would be, what if Satan sucked at most things instead of being great at most things? While Satan was a mentor/father figure to Faye, Jin is the older brother of the series protagonist, Shion Uzuki. And yeah, they have a pretty awful relationship at the beginning of the game. She blames him for the death of their parents, and he's not great at communication, so he never really explained his very valid point of view of things. And the whole bad at communication thing gets a bit worse later on. He's also extremely rooted in tradition. Now, the Uzukis are pretty obviously supposed to be Japanese, so he's heavily rooted in old Japanese customs, and this is pretty impressive, just that these customs survived in general, since the year is at some point in the 6000s, which, I mean, I'm just amazed that any of this lasted this far. He's heavily rooted in the Japanese stuff, just because that is the culture of his ancestors, but he also seems to care about preservation of Earth culture in general, because he's running a bookstore of physical paper books the first time we see him in episode 2. Pre-Miltian conflict, and up until then, he was a soldier for the Galaxy Federation, and served under Colonel Margulis as some sort of subordinate. He also had a failed romantic relationship with Pellegrini at some point, and I'd like to point out, Pellegrini has some similarities to Yui Uzuki. Yeah, they have a romantic connection with the Katana dude, and they have the same hair color, but also, Yui and Satan met when he, as a Solaris agent, invaded her country of Shavat, and they came to blows. There is some reports that she beat him and they fell in love when she was nursing him back to health. So yeah, Pellegrini, also a competent fighter, sorta has some duels with Jin at various points in time. And I'd just like to point out, Pellegrini can use an ES. Does that mean that Yui could use an Omni Gear? I don't know, she never gets a chance. She's stuck on helping the Lahan people the entire game. I'd actually, honestly, play like a resource management or strategy game just based on that, but God knows we're never getting another Xenogears at any point in time, so let alone a spin-off. Anyway, Shion's father leaked some important info to Jin about Utik's shady dealings, trying to expose them because he felt guilty about the whole human experimentation thing. Jin took this data, and stuff kinda happened at that point. During the Miltian conflict, he was acting under the orders of Helmer, who was some sort of military leader instead of a representative at that point, and even 14 years later they seemed to be trusted associates. He also stole the Y data from Margulis, and that's when they started their big rivalry thing. During the conflict, he encountered Chaos and Kanan, and accompanied them on their mission to try and rescue the URTVs, where he encountered Margulis, they had their first epic fight, and they traded heavy injuries. The data he had also ended up with Kanan, and that eventually became a big deal. At some point after parting ways with Chaos and Kanan, he also received a distress signal from his father, who was in the acute neurosis treatment facility, but arrived far too late after they were murdered and after Shion did her whole calling the Gnosis thing, which, because she was so traumatized, she blacked out a lot of memories from that time period. She thinks that he was just straight up too late, and that it was his fault they died. He's shown a little bit talking to Shion once and in the credits of episode 1, but makes his first real appearance after the party lands on Second Miltia. A chance encounter causes him to reunite with Shion, Chaos, and Junior, who we'd all known before, and then eventually he gets tapped by Helmer to join the group with Kanan again as they go to Old Miltia. He doesn't have too much luck reconnecting with Shion, but he does manage to give one somewhat successful pep talk to her during this episode. He's also a very major character in A Missing Year because, well, most of the main characters don't show up in that. You got Shion, Cosmos is there, Nephilim's there, and then besides that, there's Doctus, who's introduced for the first time and is kind of important in episode 3, then, like, Yuli Mizrahi, and then Jin. That's basically it. So he seems to play a bigger role than he did even in episode 2, just because there aren't many other characters. After episode 2, he was assigned by the subcommittee to help deal with the Gnosis terrorism incidents, and gets involved in pursuing Doctus and Scientia, having connections with Shion at this point because there was stuff happening there. Cosmos got wrecked, and when Cosmos gets wrecked, Shion gets mad and stuff. And then he's also roped into dealing with the whole Grimoire Verum, doing his Nephilim thing, and Ars Nova. He also ends up having to fight young Realian girls twice in very quick succession here for some reason. He's joined by a 100 series for a little bit, and then she gets infected, so he has to kill her. And then the climactic fight at the end is him and Cosmos fighting Almadel, who is a Fibronia-type Realian human thing. So that's just kind of a weird quirk. And then he also helps snap Shion out of contemplating suicide when she's traumatized yet again, but this drives another wedge between them. As of episode 3, he's now working with the Elsa crew and was given his own ES in the form of Ruben, which bears a striking similarity to Citan's Omni Gear. Throughout 3, he's a much better rock for Shion, especially during the fake past section when she has to confront all that stuff. Kevin being back does complicate things a bit because she's torn between her brother, who she still has lingering resentment for, and Kevin, who she still has lingering traces of him abusing her, which makes things very problematic at various points in time. He does obviously see that Alan is in love with Xion and genuinely seems to care about him, and he realizes that he legitimately wants what's best for her and is trying to help him out. He's also obviously saddened by having to kill Pellegrini and Margulis, and is kind of annoyed by the fact that they realized that Ormus was kind of a sham, but they still wanted to fight him instead of, hey, let's get revenge on the people who did this to us. And eventually, at the end, he sadly does give his life to try and buy time for Chaos to work his whole bringing the Zohar and Gnosis back to Lost Jerusalem. Xion, for some reason, sort of half believes he's still alive and they'll meet again even after all this, which I hope she doesn't get as traumatized again when she realizes that he's dead. This time, the big secret isn't any real betrayal thing, but it's the fact that he knew all along that their father was a good person, and a failure to communicate is what prevented him from going through with actually explaining that. The thing is, Jin's failure to communicate is a problem. That's because, after the conflict, he seemed to drift between jobs. Xion mentions he can't hold one for over 6 months. His current job as of episode 2 is bookseller, and then he kind of goes back to fighting after that. At one point though, or the last time Xion saw him, he was a doctor. And Jin mentions that in this day and age, doctors are just basically therapists for old people. So, he was a therapist who wasn't good at communicating. That's kind of a problem. And also, every time after this, someone that represents this archetype is going to die. It is a fact of life. Also, Jin looks a lot like Satan, but the similarity gets a bit hazy from here, at least appearance-wise. For Xenoblade 1, you're obviously going to jump to Dunban, but the interesting thing is that the archetype has now been split between 2 characters, and will remain like that for the rest of the series so far. Usually, one will get the katana and the badass fighting style, while the other gets the more conflicting with the protagonist traits, although this changes up a little bit in 2. Also, only one character out of the 2 will have the design similarity to Satan and Jin. So, what's the archetype change this time? Dunban obviously gets the being a badass and the katana, but overall he's a pretty generic previous generation hero type, which, while yeah, Satan might be kind of generic, and Jin is a mutation of Satan's traits, I don't think they're quite as generic as Dunban is. Not even saying that's a bad thing. Dunban's cool, he's just not super original. Who gets the conflicting part? It is Dixon. He is effectively Shulk's father, but was actually grooming him to be a proper good little vessel for Zanza the entire time. From here on out, one of the 2 people who the archetype has been split between will be an outright antagonist, at least at some point in the story. Dixon is basically, what if Satan actually was a bad guy? But then, Dunban is also much closer to his sister, despite that family also losing both their parents to an enemy force, when Dunban was probably of fighting age. Dunban is actually, what if Jin had never left the soldier life, and actually had a good relationship with his sister? Also, I'd like to point out, Jin is trying to help Alan out with Xion, and then Dunban also hardcore shifts Shulk and Fiora, so like, we've also got the through line of these 2 characters really wanting their sisters to get laid. I don't know. It's just the thing these games did. Overall, this archetype cares a lot about family, and we get to see what happens when it gets threatened. When Dunban gets even more revengey than Shulk towards Mumkar. Him almost going as far as Shulk with the whole killing a Hams thing seems to be trying to say something about revenge, but like, Shulk went from wanting to kill everyone to wanting to save everyone, and Dunban went from wanting to stop everyone to wanting to kill Mumkar specifically, and if there's any one face who deserves it, it's definitely Mumkar, so that one's a little bit muddled. Dunban also keeps the Japanese theme going with the cherry blossom stuff, and, well, the katana, and he does look a bit like the last 2, while Dixon is just Hulk Hogan, who is distinguishedly not Japanese. And then Dixon also keeps the dying trend going by dying after you fight him. Moving on to X, now that we know there's going to be a split, it's pretty easy to see who the 2 characters are. Nagi gets the badass and the katana, while Lao gets also pretty badass. And the design, he looks basically like Space Dunban, and I remember distinctly, before the game came out, before we even got names for most of the characters, we got what Lao's design was, and all we knew is that he seemed to be using a sniper rifle. He was called Gunban for a very long time, and I'm very glad that that was a thing. Just a very good memory in general. We know very little about Nagi, but despite that, he's gotten his own video too, and nothing's really important other than the fact that he's extremely cool. He even carries over some of the Cherry Blossom stuff since he has Blossom Dance, and he is almost certainly Japanese. Lao, on the other hand, is basically, what if Satan did lose his family? He had a wife and a young daughter just like Satan did, but they were killed basically just by bureaucracy. He snapped and came to either the conclusion that humanity didn't deserve to exist at all because most of them were bastards, or that he just didn't want to live in a world without his family, and sold NLA out to the Ganglion. He does sort of have Lynn as a morality pet slash surrogate second daughter, and it is largely because of her actions that he decides to kind of relent on the destroying humanity thing. But yeah. Lao is also the one who dies. He sacrifices himself to stop Luxar and mutates into the final boss before finally succumbing. Of course, he's still alive apparently because cliffhangers, but he dies before he comes back, so I'm going to still count this as the death thing happening. In Xenoblade 2/Torna, it is also pretty obvious that Morag got the badass part while Jin got the katana and antagonism, but at this point the archetype's been twisted so much, it is legitimately a little blurry. Who has the design carryover? Morag does sort of look like a female Dunban or Lao, but Jin is a guy and has the long hair and is more likely to look Japanese if the art style was more realistic because Tornin Blade, Torna is Fantasy Japan, but his hair is white and looks a bit different than the long straight hair that everyone else has had. I'm going to personally say Morag here because nothing ever really pointed to Dunban himself being Japanese. Only having the aesthetic and the blossom thing and the katana, while Lao, based on his name, is more likely to be Chinese, despite him having a more clear personality through line between him and Satan or Saga Jin. All things considered, Morag is relatively simple. What if Dunban was girl and also was princess? She's the same badass career soldier, similar personality, got the stoic thing, same no parents, same opposite gender younger sibling they have a close special relationship with. Fiora was half raised by Dunban. Niall and Morag grew up together and call themselves siblings, but they're actually cousins. The same stoic demeanor is dropped when the sibling is threatened and or presumed dead. They're both dodge tanks. They're also frequently shipped with the most improbably dressed woman in the game. You could argue about Bridget, but I'm not arguing about Vinaya. And some of these traits are obviously shared with Saga Jin too, but she's more clearly a direct Xenoblade 2 equivalent of Dunban than a reference to him. She also does not use a katana as her main weapon. She's a driver, and primarily uses Bridget's whip swords. But she's a driver. She can use most weapon types. She can use a chroma katana, and she's even given a Geon's core crystal as part of the story, but the real actual katana user is Jin because his katana looks more like the ones everyone else used when compared to a Geon's giant blocky thing, and just all the chroma katanas in general. Jin isn't really a spin on Satan either. He's a bit closer to Lao. He is, what if Lao's trauma was on steroids? What if one man lost literally everything and then had centuries of life to contemplate and become bitter? The man who took it all away, Amalthus, wasn't removed from power and basically controlled the world. And then he made friends with Malos, the guy he was trying to kill back in Torna, and the rest of Torna the organization. This was his new family. The best part about Torna is how they just straight up are a family. They can use the power of friendship just as much as the heroes can, and that's a really fantastic trope, and it's what makes them dangerous far more than the fact that they're all powerful blades. When I say Torna is a family replacing the one he lost from old Torna, That's not an insult to them. He needed people like this who cared about him. And this support probably kept him from completely destroying everything up until he actually tried that during the game. And the best part is, the new family seems to respect the old family. Like, he still has Laura's body on their ship. No one seems to think that's weird. No one seems to question him on it. Even Malos, who fought against Laura before and was partially to blame for her dying, still respects that. And I think that's really good. Torna are very good characters. Let's just say that. Anyway, unlike Lao, he did see that there were some people worth saving, but despite that, he shares their goal to destroy the Architect himself, basically because he doesn't think a benevolent god would allow a world where such tragedies would happen, which is also actually fairly similar to Krellian, which does kind of make sense. He does have some other references to past Katana Man characters. Empty Moments animation is a reference to one of Satan's death blows from Gears. Some of his relationship with Laura has shades of Xion and Jin's relationship, especially when she's younger. She looks a lot like Estelle, who looks a lot like Xenoblade 2 Xion, because she is Xenoblade 2 Xion, so there you go. He also gives the best speech in the game from the end of Torna. A lot of the previous people of this archetype also did that, and, also he died in the end. So what are all the twists? Satan seemed to be a double agent, but was actually a good guy the entire time. Saga Jin was withholding information because social skills, but never maliciously so. Dixon was actually evil the entire time. And then Lao and Jin both experienced a fall from heroism, but then tried to redeem themselves at the end by killing the main villain. Also, Xenoblade 2 Jin does seem to have some communication issues because Malos doesn't seem to realize that all Jin wanted to do is connect with him, according to the game. So there's that. And that is the video. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, I apologize yet again for the audio quality. Hopefully this will be fixed by the next video, which I'm recording this before Definitive Edition drops. So when I say hopefully it's fixed by the next video, hopefully it's fixed early enough for me to make a whole wowie kazowie, this is the future connected ending explained video once I finish that. So yeah, there's that. But yeah, I liked this video. I think I did a decent job with it. And I really like the series staple thing. Hopefully, once I got Future Connected out of the way, I'll be like, yep, these are all the archetypes. I can just kind of do like one of these a month or something, because these are fun to research and fun to make, and I hope you enjoy them too. Until next time, this is Crappy Audio Luxon, signing off.